Hello. There's a lot of debate about the question whether tele-extenders or teleconverters are still worth it now that we have very high resolution cameras with 45, 50 or even 60 megapixel, and the question comes up if we can just crop and get basically the same or even better image quality than when using such a tele-extender. A few years ago, you often heard that you should only use these teleconverters with high, expensive and fast prime lenses, and I was also usually giving this advice when people asked me at workshops whether they should buy a tele-extender or not. On the other hand, you can see I have 3 zoom lenses here with me. They range from quite cheap ones between $600-700 up to the very expensive RF100-300 that costs over $10,000. And I did some tests with the 1.4 and the 2x extender, compared the image quality, the noise if you use the extender or just crop into the image. And I also want to talk about the autofocus, how much the autofocus basically suffers when using an extender, and also some thoughts about practical things that you should keep in mind that might also make a big decision whether it's worth to use an extender in some situations or not. So let's start with the RF100-300mm, the most expensive out of the 3 lenses. And you can see here the overall scene, and on the left we have the image where I shot without an extender, on the right with the 1.4 extender, so giving me 420mm f4. And what I did in this test was I kept the shutter speed constant, meaning if I added the 1.4 extender, the ISO went up by 1 stop, with the 2x time extender by 2 stops, because I think this is just a realistic scenario. If we add an extender, we usually don't want to lower the shutter speed, so that's how I did it. And it's quite interesting because if you look here a bit on the upper part of the image at the background, where we have the blurry parts, you can see that the noise levels are very similar. On the right, we might have a bit more noise, a bit more grain, but it's much finer, so it's also not so distracting. And I saw this throughout my tests that basically the two balance each other. So without an extender, we have the ISO lower, but we need to crop in more, which also enhances noise. With the extender, we have a higher ISO, but we don't need to enlarge the picture so much. So this cancels each other out more or less. So let's go to sharpness, and I think here is not a dramatic difference, but the right picture, the one with the extender, seems to have the edge, just seems to resolve a bit more detail. And if we go to the edge of the image, it's a very similar pattern, I would say. No big differences, but the one with the tele extender is ever so slightly sharper. But it shows for me that if I forget the 1.4 extender or don't have time to put it in, not a drama. But how does it look like with the 2x extender? So here we end up at 600mm f5.6, and here we see bigger differences. We see clearly that the right image shows more details. You can also look on top on this small kind of yarn, or I don't know how to call it, that is sticking out here. We have much more detail in the right picture, just because we have more pixels on the subject. And if we go to the edge of the frame, it's very similar. The tele extender is really worth it. It really provides us with more detail. But to be honest, I also expected this on such an expensive lens. So how does it look for the 100-500 that is not as expensive? Well, we start also in the center of the image at 500mm f7.1, so wide open. And if we add the 1.4 extender, I think it's still better to use the extender instead of cropping. I see a bit more details, but I'm questioning already whether you will see this on YouTube with the compression. The difference is really not big. And in the edge of the frame, it's a bit a similar picture. It still looks better with the extender than cropped. But once more, the difference is pretty small, to be honest. Unfortunately, I forgot to do the test with a 2x extender, and I don't own a 2x extender. It was just a borrowed one. So here we only have the 1.4, but now let's move to the cheap 100-400. We also start with the 1.4 extender. As you can see in the center of the image, they look very similar. I feel like with the extender we lose a bit of contrast, but maybe gain a tiny bit of detail, if this makes sense. So it's pretty much doesn't matter if you crop or use the extender, in my opinion. If we go to the edge of the frame, also very similar. We see also some chromatic aberrations with both. They seem to be a bit more pronounced with the extender, but we have more detail, so yeah, it's not a big difference, to be honest. If we use the 2x extender, you can already see in this overview shot here, it's quite a difference in framing. And if we zoom all the way in, here we really see that the one with the extender gives us significantly more details. And also on the edge of the frame, we still get more details. So I think overall we can learn two things from the test. First of all, the more expensive the glass, the more it's still worth to put the extender, but it's still worth to put it with all of them. And the 1.4 extender you can kind of get away with just cropping. With the 2x extender you see really a more drastic difference. So for the autofocus, of course, there is the disadvantage that the extender makes the autofocus a bit slower. I feel nowadays with mirrorless cameras this is not as crazy anymore as it was with DSLRs. Nevertheless, you can see in this clip here how the performance drops. You can see it with the RF100-300 without an extender, the f2.8, it's very quick. And I need to say, even with the 2x extender, it's still quick. Good enough for most situations, I would say. I didn't use the 2x extender so much, but with the 1.4x extender, I was taking pictures of Swifts in flight and I had no issue whatsoever. If we put the extender on a cheaper and a bit slower lens like the RF100-400, that even without an extender has a maximum aperture of f8, things start to change a bit. The drop in speed might be the same, but we're already starting with a much slower autofocus, and here it can be problematic. I mean, if you take pictures of birds in flight with a 2x extender, I'm not sure if it will be really quick enough. And from my experience, especially with the 100-400, I had the experience that the autofocus was also having a bit more trouble to really hit the subject. So there was a bit more like imprecision in this sense. So here I would be more careful, especially once it gets a bit darker. On the other hand, there is also a positive effect of a tele-extender on the autofocus. And this is especially the case if your subject is very small in the frame and you want to use the subject detection or eye detection. If you put an extender, the subject will be bigger in the frame, and this makes it easier for the camera to detect patterns, to detect the eye. And I tested this. I will show you the clip with the 100-300. You can see without the extender, it's really struggling to focus on this small model owl that I have here. If I put the 2x extender, it's still not perfect, but it hits the owl or even the eye way more often than without the extender. Another thing you should also keep in mind with the autofocus and the extender is, depending on the lens, your autofocus area where the camera can still focus might be a bit smaller. This is no problem with the RF100-300, but with these two, depending which extender you use on which lens, you can really see how it gets a bit smaller or even much smaller, meaning you cannot put your subject a bit more in the corner of the frame. Depth of field is also very important for me, and in general it's very simple. Actually, whether you put an extender or not doesn't change the depth of field. So if we take an example, I use the 100-400 at 400mm wide open. This means I have f8. If I put the tele-extender, I get 560mm f11. If I now crop the picture taken at 400mm f8, so that I have the same kind of, crop or composition as with 560mm f11, the pictures will look identical in terms of background blur, in terms of depth of field. But it's not that simple, unfortunately, because we are dealing here with zoom lenses, and I want to give you another example now where adding an extender actually changes your depth of field. For this we will use the 100-300 just because it has a constant aperture of f2.8, which makes the calculations a bit easier. So as I mentioned, constant aperture from 100-300mm. Let's say I take some pictures at 200mm. I want a soft background, so I set it to 2.8. That's our reference frame. In another situation, I have the 2-point extender in because I was expecting a bit shyer animals. And then they're coming closer. I zoom out again to 200 millimeters, same situation. But now, because I have the 2x extender, I'm stuck at f5.6. And that's a huge difference, because this is 2 f-stops of difference. The background will look quite different, you can believe me. And actually at this point, the 100-500 provides a smoother background than the 100-300 with a 2x extender. Again, just at 200 millimeter. And it's actually very close to this one without an extender at 200 millimeter. So this has some implication of how I use the tele extenders with zoom lenses. So this means if I take the 100-300 and I expect to be shooting mostly, let's say, between 200 and 350 millimeters, I will not take the extender to get a better depth of field, or a smaller depth of field, a shallower depth of field for this nicer background blur, because stopping down is always an option if I want to, but the converter or extender can be a bit limiting here. If I expect to shoot mostly, let's say, between 300 and 400 millimeters, then I will use the 1.4 extender. There are also some practical considerations in terms of weight and handling, and of course the price. So if you buy an RF100-300 2.8 for almost 11,000, 400-500 for an extender will not make a huge difference anymore. And often if you buy a lens like this, you already have a big prime, like in my case the 600 f4. Yeah, then maybe you already have this extender anyway. However, if you have like a relative inexpensive lens like the 100-400, in Switzerland this costs around 500 to 600 bucks. That's a bit more expensive than the 1.4 extender and about the same as the 2x extender. And I think I would not spend the same amount of money on an extender than on a lens. This, for me, doesn't make much sense, to be honest. And if you use the 1.4 2x extender with this lens together, for the money of the 3 items, you can almost buy a RF200-800, which is sharper, faster, therefore provides a nicer background blur, more professional, better autofocus. The list goes on. So if in doubt, I would rather save not buying an extender, but save a bit more money to save for a more expensive and high quality lens. With the RF100-500, it's a bit more difficult. I mean, on one side, it's already a more expensive lens, so the extender doesn't seem so expensive anymore. Again, many people might already have a bigger lens than this, so they already have an extender. It also takes the extender well, as you have seen in the footage before. The problem here is that the RF100-500 is built very compact, meaning that the last element of the lens almost touches here. And this means that you can physically not install a tele extender with this long tubus here unless you zoom it into at least 300 millimeters, which means you sacrifice some of the focal range, so you get less flexible. And also, if you want to now store it in your backpack, you cannot make it smaller than this. So maybe it doesn't even fit in the backpack anymore and you need to remove the extender before storing it in the backpack, which is, I would say, less than ideal and can be a bit annoying at some times. And speaking of changing extenders, this can be something that is also not ideal because first of all, it costs you time, and I already lost quite some shots because I was switching extenders and then the bird was taking off or something. So I'm trying to do it less often. And depending on the environmental conditions, it also has the risk that there is dust or water or snow coming into the lens or into the camera, which of course you want to avoid. So I usually try avoiding to change the extender when there is like snow or heavy rainfall, or I'm at the beach and there's a bit of wind and the sand is like flying through the air. These are all situations where I would be very careful to change the extender and maybe just rather crop in post. So in a nutshell, yes, in terms of image quality, extenders are still better than cropping, even on zoom lenses of different price categories, at least for these Canon lenses here on a 45 megapixel camera. I would be very curious what your findings are. By the way, I linked all the lenses and the tele extenders in the video description if you're interested.